The proceeding will start shortly.
Good afternoon and welcome to this evidence session of the Joint Committee on Human Rights. We are a committee comprised of half members of the House of Commons and half members of the House of Lords, and our concern and our focus is on human rights. We also have a responsibility to scrutinise all legislation that's brought forward by the government for looking at the questions of whether or not it affects human rights. And in this afternoon's session, we're looking at the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill, which the government have brought forward and is currently in the House of Commons. And we're looking specifically at those clauses which affect the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities and which are about unauthorised encampments. The reason we are looking at this as a human rights issue is because there are a number of human rights engaged by these clauses which actually extend the powers of the police and criminalised unauthorised encampments. And the articles in the European Convention on Human Rights which are at issue are Article 8, the right to respect for private and family life, Article 1, which is peaceful enjoyment of possessions. This is in relation to the traveller community, but also in relation to those who own property and land, and also the prohibition of discrimination. So we're very grateful to have two panels to give evidence to us today, two panels of witnesses, and I'd like to welcome and thank for giving evidence to us our first panel, and I will introduce you to them before I ask Dean to introduce himself and ask the first question. We have Jake Bowers, who is from the Roma community, a journalist, producer, media teacher and filmmaker. We have Martin Gallagher, who is a campaigner and writes for magazines and does a blog. We have Philomena Mongan, who is also an Irish traveller, and she's Community Engagement Officer with London Gypsies and Travellers. And we have Marc Willers, QC, who's a barrister and who specialises in this area of law, having literally written a book on it as co-editor of Gypsy and Traveller Law. So thank you very much to the members of the committee here today and to those who are giving evidence to us. And could I ask Dean to introduce himself and put the first question?
Thank you, Chair. I'm Dean Russell. I'm the Member of Parliament for Watford. And if I may ask you to start off with Jake and then perhaps come to Philomena, if that's okay. I just wanted to get a sense from you and what you could tell us about what it's like to be a member of the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community in the UK in 2021.
Sure, absolutely. I'm from the Romany Gypsy community, which has been in this country for about 500 years, but I'm part of the wider European Romani community of about 12 million people, which is Europe's largest ethnic minority. And as a journalist, what I do is I travel a lot between different countries where our community lives. And if I was to put us on a sliding scale between the worst offenders of Gypsy human rights and the best protectors of Gypsy human rights, it wouldn't necessarily be towards the more positive end. There is no doubt that we are better treated than our cousins in places like Romania and Slovakia, where our people are still often beaten up routinely by the police and brutalised and treated widely as vermin in the countries that they live in. But we still have some way to go before we are accepted in the way that we are, say, in countries like Sweden, which protects our language, which has our culture, the protection of our culture enshrined in its law through things like the teaching of the Romani language in school, the right to broadcast in Romani. We are towards maybe the more liberal end of that scale, but when you actually have a look at the way that our history has been, and we live it today, we have been a people that has been excluded, shoved to the margins. A very famous writer who wrote about gypsies, Jan Joos, once put that the gypsy people live in the cracks between nations. In Britain, we live in between the cracks between communities. The caravan sites that we live on are generally built near dumps, under flyovers, in the environmentally kind of marginal parts of town where most people would dump rubbish. If you look on most local council websites, G for Gypsy comes in between F for fly tipping and H for household waste. We are still regarded as second-class citizens, treated as such, and you see that right the way throughout government legislation. The most recent one, which we live under on a daily basis, is the 1994 Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, which means that those members of our community who are nomadic and have nowhere to stop are still routinely chased from pillar to post. They are locked into a cycle of trespass and eviction, which means that some communities that I meet on a daily basis are evicted 2 or 3 times a day. They have their caravans firebombed. They are treated with suspicion, which is driven and made worse by the media. And every attempt that we make as a community to often change that situation is often pushed back on by the right-wing media, by people who have never had the opportunity to be educated about us. There is very little about us in the school curriculum. And the reason we're here all today is that situation is about to get a lot worse. On the flip side, from the inside out, we're a very robust community. We're a happy community. Both the Romany Gypsies and the Irish Travellers are extremely proud of the fact that we have survived everything the world has thrown at us, and we are determined to be here for another 500 years. What is upsetting from a human rights point of view is that we, in 2021, are still having to defend our right to our stopping places, to a nomadic way of life, which when you look at it isn't necessarily about traveling. That's one of the biggest misconceptions. The reason people live in caravans, whether they be on sites or traveling around, is so that we can live as extended family groups. Our culture comes all the way from India, as does our language, the Indian language, and we're extremely proud that we've kept some of that alive. In 2021, we should be celebrating that. We should be cheering the fact that we have survived so long, not as we are today, looking at the police bill, which will be driving a final nail into the life of nomadic life in this country. So we're proud of being who we are. We're not going anywhere. We've had a hard time, and we would like it to get better.
Thank you for sharing. And if I may ask the same question to Philomena, then I'll ask my next question to Martin and Marc, just to let you know I'll come to you next. So Philomena, same question to you. What's life like in 2021 from your perspective?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me on this panel today. I appreciate it very much. My name is Philomena Mongan, and I am an Irish Traveller, and I am the Community Engagement Officer at London Gypsies and Travellers. I've lived in London for over 35 years, travelled up and down the M25 where my kids had the side of the road. I have witnessed firsthand the discrimination and prejudice right in my face over my 35 years of living in Britain. What can I say? I'm a mom. I do the school run. I walk the dogs. The average mom for anyone that don't know me, but it's a majority of small-minded people that just pins me out and make me feel different. My kids have witnessed discrimination also being thrown at them. I have been refused entry to clubs, pubs, restaurants, parks, cafes, followed around supermarkets, followed through streets. My kids have been turned away from sports clubs, swimming pools, made to feel ashamed, made to be embarrassed, made to feel very low for don't understand why, asking questions that I cannot answer for them. It's really, really struggling to be a traveller, a gypsy in London today. We hold our heads up high. We have no shame. We have nothing to be ashamed to be ashamed of. But something has to change. The discrimination and the prejudice community, myself and my family, has to change. It has to give way. People has to see the bigger picture. You know, we see enough of that in television every morning. We turn it on.
I think Philomena's internet connection has frozen. Perhaps we could. Oh, you're back with us. Oh.
Okay. Sadly, it's still frozen.
I think we've lost Philomena. Perhaps we should go to Marc then, Dean, for the next part of your question.
Thank you. So, Marc, if I may, and I'll come to you, Martin, afterwards, if that's okay. The government and public authorities are under a positive obligation under Article 8 of the ECHR to facilitate the Gypsy way of life. From your experience, especially within the legal profession, do you think that public authorities are delivering on these obligations in practice?
Well, can I begin by saying thank you also for inviting me to speak. From my perspective, as a barrister representing Gypsies and Travellers now for over 30 years, I would conclusively say that public authorities are not meeting that positive obligation to facilitate the Gypsy way of life. It was first noted by the European Court of Human Rights back, I think, in about the year 2000, that the Article 8 rights protected by the Convention, the right to respect for one's home and family life, included a right to respect for one's traditional way of life. And because of the vulnerability of Gypsies and Travellers within our society, and indeed in European states that are affiliated with the Council of Europe, there is a positive obligation to facilitate that way of life. An integral part of that being the fact that Gypsies and Travellers have traditionally lived in caravans. And as Jake said, it's about living in caravans, not necessarily, and it's a misconception, the need to travel. But there are, as we know, many Gypsies and Travellers who wish to continue living in accordance with their traditional way of life in caravans, but have no lawful place to stop in those caravans. And those are the people that the Police Act, if it's enacted, will hit the hardest. The people who need a site, they need a transit site or a permanent site from where they can get their kids to school, they can access appropriate healthcare. And the unfortunate thing is that for the last 50, or perhaps it's now nearer 60 years, since the closure of the Commons back in 1960, local authorities have been failing in their obligations under successive pieces of legislation and government planning policy to meet the accommodation needs of Gypsies and Travellers, to provide sufficient permanent and transit sites. Now, in 1968, when it became clear that the closure of the Commons was causing real problems, a bill was promoted by Lord Eric Avebury, who I'm sure many of you on the panel will remember very fondly, as a fantastic advocate for Gypsy and Traveller rights. And that passed as the Caravan Sites Act, and about 300 local authority sites were built in accordance with the duty to provide sites enacted thereby. But the problem was that not enough local authorities built enough sites. By 1994, that duty was repealed in the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act. And unfortunately, the government of the day concluded that the way forward would be to encourage private site provision. And I'm afraid that was either very naive or disingenuous, because the reality is that requires local authorities to grant planning permission to those who have the wherewithal to make the application. And unfortunately, local authorities tend to bow to the pressure of their local residents. So without that statutory duty enforced as it should have been by a central government, local authorities failed to assess the needs of Gypsies and Travellers, to identify appropriate land where they might be accommodated and where they might apply for and obtain planning permission. And so we have this never-ending cycle of those who have nowhere to station their caravans lawfully, who are being moved around from pillar to post, effectively on a road to nowhere, and in a situation where they can't access appropriate healthcare or education. And that's why we have, predominantly amongst those who have nowhere lawfully to stop, particularly high problems in terms of low life expectancy, high maternal mortality rates, and low educational attainment. So I'm afraid if you put all that together, you've got a very sad picture, and one which leaves gypsies and travellers in this country in an even more vulnerable position than they would other be because of the prejudice that Jake described that gypsies and travellers face on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. And if I may come to you now, Martin, I'm conscious I've got many colleagues who want to come in. So if you're okay to keep the answer relatively brief so that they can get through all the questions, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to come from a Welsh context as well, where we have a statutory duty to provide transit sites and residential sites, but still we're at a level where there's 0 transit sites in Wales, and we're still drastically kind of underproviding in regards to residential pitches. And to kind of expand on what Mark said in regards to encampments turning up each year facing a local campaign that's full of hate, including political opposition as well. That kind of highlights the lack of political will to want to address these. Address the needs for GRT people that are in those areas. And then, when it comes to the point of this bill, we're going to face an even more drastic kind of situation where we're going to be looking at less protection and human rights, essentially. So to touch on what Mark was saying before, the right to live, children's rights, to be safe and have a home and practice their culture, they're all going to be drastically under threat by this bill.
Thank you for sharing those testimonies. I'll hand back to you now, Chair.
Thanks very much. You've raised the issue about Wales. Can I just bring in Joanna at this point to raise the issue about Scotland and England and Wales?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Joanna Cherry. I'm the Member of Parliament for Edinburgh South West. Thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. It's really a fascinating evidence session so far. Mark mentioned Wales. I just wondered if any of the other panellists had any experience of the situation in Scotland and whether you'd be able to tell us how it compares with England and Wales.
Who'd like to answer that? Jake.
Sorry, Jake first.
So I have some knowledge rather than a lot of direct experience. And from what I understand in Scotland, the Scottish government has adopted the practice of negotiated stopping. I heard that from a Scottish traveller activist friend of mine just a couple of days ago, that as an institution, the Scottish government seems to be much more humane in the way that it treats its gypsy and traveller community. There is obviously a different community, the Scottish traveller community, that has a very fascinating and interesting heritage that comes out of the kind of the Highlands, as well as blending with Romani identity, which makes it a fascinating community all of its own. There are obviously kind of dark spots. There's a place called Bobbin Mill, which is up in Pitlochry, which was a tinker rehousing experiment, which is not a very nice place to live. So it's by no means a clean bill of health, but I think most people would probably say that the attitudes in Scotland are probably better than they are in England, and probably Wales as well.
Would anybody else like to comment?
Perhaps I could just comment.
Mark,
in this.
thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Only to say this, Joanna, that in my recent dealings with a couple of universities in Scotland, we've identified a kind of a desert in terms of legal advice for Scottish gypsy travellers. And now it may be doing the Scottish legal profession something of a disservice because we haven't perhaps been introduced to the right people. But although there appears to be a very positive approach by the Scottish government at the moment, engaging with Scottish Gypsy Travellers, and one person in particular I know, David Donaldson, but others with him. I don't think that there is much of a developed legal, as it were, following of for Scottish Gypsy Travellers to work with in circumstances where they need that advice and representation. But it may be because we just haven't knocked on the right doors yet. But and you may have more information than I do about that, Joanna.
Yeah, maybe we could have a useful discussion about that after this evidence session and pursue that independently of the evidence session. Martin and Philomena, do you have any experience of travelling in Scotland?
I never travelled in Scotland. I travelled around England and so the Reading Way and stuff like that. Again, kind of talking about our mutual friend Mark, David Donaldson, who is doing amazing work in regards to what's going on up in Scotland. I last seen him, talking on BBC Scotland in regards to GRT history or culture. There was a festival in a university. I think that I don't know if he started or something, but it showed that the mindset and the attitude towards GRT people that Scotland do have, and that would be welcome everywhere else. I know Wales is following that lead with our legislation and stuff like that, and the new Race and Equality Action Plan that does have a lot of GRT focused positive laws coming in. So but yeah, in regards to Scotland, that's my only experience.
Thank you. Philomena, have you travelled in Scotland?
Never had that chance, but I'd love to.
Okay, well, you'd be very welcome.
Thanks very much. Sorry about the internet, guys.
Okay.
Thank you, Joanna. Cheers for that.
Thank you. Chair.
Okay, thank you. The proposed changes that are within the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill that we're focusing on today relate to unauthorised encampments. Could you tell us why you believe some members of the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community set up unauthorised encampments? Is the problem the number of spaces available on authorised sites, or where the authorised sites are located, or something else? And we know this was a manifesto commitment in the Conservative Party's election manifesto on which they were elected in 2019. But what do you think is motivating the government to be proposing these new powers to deal with unauthorised encampments? Who would like to start with that? I noticed Jake is nodding, so perhaps we can start with you, Jake. Oh, you need to unmute if you would.
What's it motivated by? If I'm absolutely honest, I think it's motivated by racial hatred. I think that the Conservative Party looks around a country that it doesn't necessarily like or recognise anymore in terms of its diversity, but also realises that there are very few targets left. There are very few targets left in society where you can stigmatise, where you can other, where you can blame without any recourse in public life or the media other than the Gypsy and Traveller community. And so it has brought in this bill on what is actually a relatively small problem. It's a big problem for the people that have to live it in terms of being nomadic with nowhere to live, but it's actually a really small problem. Probably about 10 years or so ago, the Equality and Human Rights Commission estimated that to find sites for all the people that were living at the side of the road would be 1 square mile of Britain. And we are many thousands of square miles. Now, that's what I think motivates it. I think that's where it's coming from. It's coming from what George Monbiot, the writer, described as performative prejudice, that it is a prejudice that can still be got away with, and it's red meat for people in the Tory shires, it's red meat for the people on the Tory backbenches, and they will obviously vote for it. But if I could just, for a moment, talk about the way that people experience the legislation as it currently is, and then you will see whether it's needed. the way that people experience criminal justice that Mark mentioned, as it currently is they are routinely pushed from pillar to post. I spoke to a family just the other day in Kent that had been evicted from a site in Eastbourne where they'd been for a couple of days, and they were put together in a convoy and escorted out of Sussex like something out of the Dukes of Hazzard until they got across the Kent border, where they then found somewhere to stop, where they've been relatively left alone for a couple of days. That power comes from Section 61 of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act. There are more than enough powers to chase and harass people. There's all stick and there's no carrot. There's no legal duty to provide sites for people. So we're in this situation where, maybe a couple of thousand families, that's how they live every day. And with that comes hostility. The family that I spoke to, the man spoke very movingly about how his caravan had been attacked by a petrol bomb and nearly burnt his newborn child to death. And I said, did you take any pictures? Do you have any evidence of this? And he said, no, he didn't. And he said, to be honest, Jay, this happens on such a regular basis that we don't even really remark upon it anymore. For that to happen in our country is a damning indictment of our country. To be living in a country which is now saying we need to crank up the police powers even more is a damning indictment of where we are headed as a country. Because for them, that life will be extinguished. And it's a beautiful life when you're not being harassed. You have 15 families that are all living together. Their cousins, brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles, granddad, granny, all living together. Their environmental impact is very minimal compared to living in housing. They provide trades and services wherever they go. They're keeping a culture that is rich, that is 1,000 years old, that's come from India, alive. And what's being signalled by the police bill is that has no place in Britain. Just a final point. For me, we are the canary in the coal mine of liberty. And if our life and our culture gets stamped out, everybody else's is just one step behind. And it depresses me, the content of this bill.
Thank you. Philomena would like to come in next. Will you deal with the issue about whether or not one of the problems is the number of spaces available on authorised sites or where the sites are located?
Yeah, what I'd like to say, I'm not sure I'm not. What I'd like to say on that matter is it's been 20 years since any caravan site has been built in London. It's been 20 years since there has been a new site put up. There's no stopping places and there's no transit sites. So this is why you see the rise in families moving on to, pieces of land that they need to pull onto to rest themselves, maybe for overnight, to bring in clean water, for kids to have a rest, to do a bit of shopping and whatever. And even more than that, there's people that's on the move that just like to move for the summer. They always have a home to go back to. Maybe they might have a council house, or they might have a temporary accommodation somewhere else. Maybe. But there's the people that really have no home, that really does travel for, that is their, that's what they do. Don't have any more cars or have a permanent home. They like to travel. But can you imagine the person that's been put off, and if their caravan, if their car has been seized by the police, where does that leave them on the side of the road? Isn't that come back to a government problem or a council problem then to try and sort this family out if they're homeless? So if we're pushing for sites, we've been pushing this last 15, 20 years for sites to be built. We don't see the government. They have the obligation under, the obligation to provide sites, but we don't see the council and the government, and I don't see the MPs putting more power on them to use their obligation to sort out caravan sites and temporary stopping place and transit sites, and it would solve a lot of the problems.
Thank you. Could we hear from Martin and then Mark?
Hey, I'm just going to go through that quick. The problem is that the number of sites available that's the biggest issue. The head of Martin Hewitt said yesterday that the biggest issue here is not the legislation. That's sufficient enough. It's the availability of sites. It's the fact that there's no sites or there's no pitches on unauthorized encampments. and the planning process is criminally unfairly stacked against GRT people from building their own accommodation. It's that political will again. Again, low number of transit sites, which people have nowhere to go. They go to an area, they're met with a really hate-fueled campaign, and then it's a victory when they go away for the year and then come back again, and that later, that next year, and it all starts again. It's that vicious cycle that Marc was talking about before. There's myths as well that we have the option to stay at the caravan club. We're discriminated there as well. We're not allowed there. Nobody, I don't think, is fighting for unauthorized encampments. Is the fact that we want places to stay that are safe, that allow us to have a hygienic and don't have a risk factor to our health. The government acknowledged that poor air quality is the largest environmental risk to public health, introducing new laws to fight this. Yet all sites that are proposed are always near dual carriageways, and they're still there after 10, 20 years. I grew up on one, 35. I've got chronic asthma because of it. The site I lived on was next to a sewage system where, human waste was pumped into the river next to us daily, and it was disgusting. That's what people are still there now, 20 minutes away from me. So it's about making sustainable sites that have this, have the same respect as the likes of the caravan club, where they can reside somewhere that is clean, healthy, sustainable, and safe. And then in going back to question B, to call a spade, with the government kind of proposing that, stripping people of their rights to a nomadic life, not just that, but also criminalizing it. It's pushing people to bricks and mortar housing. It's essentially forced assimilation. It's taken away our nomadic right. It's taken away the rights of all of our children that we have to enjoy who we are on our culture, and taking away those rights, but also again threatening them and making us fearful of that as well by criminalizing it. It's a dangerous precursor to what could happen later on, like Jake said, down the line. We've already had the Times article calling for ethnic cleansing, so that was this weekend. So it's a really dangerous precursor.
Could you just tell me what your estimate is of the numbers now of the community? Is the community getting bigger or getting smaller, or is it staying the same?
It's going to be a skewed number always, isn't it? Because
yes.
the engagement with, the trust and engagement with, say, the public services, where, so like in Scotland, the NHS posted out memos to not serve GRT people that pulled up in a car park. So they're not going to trust the system in regards to the census. They're not going to trust the system in regards to engaging with services. They just kind of, in Wales we've had. But
without asking you to, give a forensic figure, just to give us a sense, is this a diminishing community, or is this a relatively stable community, or is it a growing community?
I would say it's a growing community based on the need, based on the need of sites and both residential and transit. It is a growing need. It's a growing community, and the provision of sites and stuff, whereas for us to stay, is not, those needs aren't met for that group.
Yeah, I think I'm asking something different, which is not about the number of sites authorised or unauthorised, but just the basic community altogether. Jake, do you want to have a go at answering that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is undoubtedly, we are a community that is growing. We still have large families. I'm one of 17, right? So we still have large families. And you also have to factor into this, into the wider concept of human rights and protection of minorities, that in the last 15, 20 years, probably about 200 to 300,000 Roma from Eastern European countries have migrated to Britain, many of them applying for settled status. So once what this may have been a community which is about 300,000 people, is probably more like 500,000 or 600,000 people. The big difference with Roma being, of course, is that they are often coming from kind of urban environments where, to be brutally frank, the communist regimes shot their horses and burnt their wagons. So they're further down the line of being assimilated into housing. I mean, there are still conflicts, but you're talking about a community that is undoubtedly growing through migration, but also through large family sizes. Yeah.
Thank you. Mark, just to answer my general question.
Yeah, so you might like to just add to the statistics that I think there are about 60,000 Romani Gypsies and Irish travellers living in caravans. So there's a cohort of about 300,000 indigenous, if I can call them that, Romani Gypsies and Irish travellers and new travellers. About 60,000 of those appear to be living in caravans, and some of those, about 15% perhaps, are on unauthorised encampments and unauthorised developments without planning permission, without any lawful stop in place. So answering the other questions, though, I think, in fact, in my first answer, I probably addressed the reasons why unauthorised encampments are set up, because of the fact that there aren't enough sites. The motivation, though, is in my mind very much an interest in pandering to the prejudice that Jake spoke about. But there is also another, perhaps, more subtle consideration, and that is this, that under the planning policy that we have now incorporated in Planning Policy for Traveller Sites, issued in 2015, which kind of replaced the Labour government's 2006 planning policy, there is a definition of what it means to be a gypsy or traveller, which is invidious. I mean, it excludes all those who are too old and too ill to travel, no matter that they want planning permission to obtain permission to live in a caravan, as it were, as they have done all their lives, perhaps up until they were disabled or too old to travel for work. The assessment of who it is to be, who can therefore fit within that definition, requires evidence of travelling. But this criminalisation of trespass provision in the bill will restrict that ability, and therefore force a lot of people to take up perhaps more sedentary work and to no longer travel. So they're put in a position where they won't be able to fall within the definition. They won't get counted in accordance with the requirement to assess the needs of gypsies and travellers by carrying out what's called a Gypsy and Traveller accommodation assessment. And those needs won't be met by the identification of land that would accommodate. So this is a kind of a situation where the legislation that is proposed will reduce the need to accommodate gypsies and travellers in accordance with their traditional lifestyle. So there may be, it seems to me, a more subtle reason underlying these legislative provisions to drive gypsies and travellers off the road, where they can no longer fall within the planning policy definition, restricted as it now is to those who continue to travel for work. And I'm afraid that is, again, another problem and another reason why this legislation is going to impact on the most vulnerable members of our society. One other thing to say is, I know that when you first introduced this issue, you talked about Article 8 and Article 14 and Article 1, Protocol 1. But actually, I think it goes further than that in terms of the scope of the impacts on human rights that are thrown up by this proposed legislation. I think we should think about Article 3 too. I say Article 3 as well. In other words, the right not to be subject to inhuman and degrading treatment, because that is effectively what this legislation, if it's enacted, will do. It will force gypsies and travellers into a position where they can no longer exercise their traditional way of life, and where they will be subject to even greater speed in terms of eviction from places where they stop, when they have nowhere lawful to park their caravans.
Thank you very much. Baroness Massey, would you like to introduce yourself and put the next question? Could you unmute yourself, please?
Thank you, Harriet. Yes, I want to start off. I'm Doreen Massey. I'm a Labour peer in the House of Lords, and I want to start off with a question to Martin, please, because he mentioned being a child and the impact of the environment on his health. And I want to ask you, Martin, I mean, there are lots of conventions on the rights of children. The main one is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the Article 4 says that governments must do all they can to make sure every child can enjoy their rights by creating systems and passing laws that promote and protect children's rights. And those are the rights such as education, health, the environment, being heard, and so on. I wonder what you think would be the impact of the new law on Gypsy and Traveller children?
Well, personally, from my perspective, you know, losing their home is going to cause. Well, you've got homeless children. That's the immediate problem. You know, that then causes stress and a demand on that local authority or where they live. You know, that takes away their education. You know, I'm a PhD student. I'm fortunate to have a scholarship with Northumbria Uni. So, you know, I know the stereotype is there that we, you know, don't like education. That's, you know, we love it. There are loads of us that want an education, and this bill threatens, you know, just being able to access it. It threatens us being able to access standard healthcare. You know, Dan Allen from the British Association of Social Workers says that not just the UNCRC, but also the 1989 Children Act, 2004 Children Act, the Care Act, and the Social Work Act 2012. This bill will violate those all as well. You know, so it's it impedes on a lot of children's rights in regards to that as well. I mean, we've touched on before being able to practice your culture. Children shouldn't see their families criminalized for being who we are. You know, it's like Jake said before, you know, 10, 20 families traveling around together. For me, being in the field in the summer was one of the best times of my life, you know, and we had stones thrown at us by locals. We did nothing, you know, to instigate that. We never retaliated. We faced that prejudice and discrimination, but you know, that develops, to me anyway. I now have regular communications and sessions with counsellors because of PTSD and trauma, which I've been diagnosed with, because, you know, learning what racism and discrimination is at 5 years old and being treated and discriminated because you are different at 5 years old, you know, that leaves a lasting impression. That affects you growing older. You know, nowadays children are on Facebook and social media seeing these newspaper articles about unauthorized encampments and seeing kill them all, burn their caravans, they all deserve to die, the Second Amendment will sort this out. And, you know, the older generation that, you know, who aren't as literate, they're not on social media talking and challenging this. It's the younger generation who are, you know, so they're going to develop these anxieties, and then they're going to be worried that another Johnny Delaney, you know, a little boy who was murdered in Cheshire just for being a gypsy, you know, it leads to those anxieties as well. So there's, you know, these children who are going to face this bill, if it comes in as it is, they're going to face a lot more than what I've just said, because that's what we have now. You know, so this bill is a dangerous precedent to children's development. Yeah.
I'd love to spend hours on this, but we can't. But if
anybody, me too. Yeah.
If anybody has anything to add in writing, I'm sure that would be very, very, very welcome. Unless somebody else has something to add right now. But I do have two other questions. That was the sort of question I slipped in, but I think it's really important and fascinating one.
Yeah, I just like to say, with people judging people, not my son is 17, he's in college, and my daughter's from school back in the year. But I remember when the kids were smaller, and we come back to a certain campsite every year. The teacher knew the kids quite well. My kids are very small, the older ones, but they'd made friends in school. But when you'd walk your kids home, and the parents would walk their kids, and they'd see you taking your kid into the campsite. Then when your child went back to school the next day, that kid wasn't allowed to play. So they were being singled out because the parent told the child not to mix with the gypsy child or the traveller child. So you had your kid home asking questions, that they hadn't got a friend who didn't understand why. And then it's like, as the years get older, my name was on the Pontons list, right? Can you imagine go for that holiday and then when you were refused it, you're looking for this opportunity to get more?
I think Philomena, we're having problems with your connection again. Baroness Massey, would you like to proceed with the next part of your question? I think we just I don't know whether everybody's got the same problem, but I'm finding it impossible to hear Philomena.
I'll go back to my original question then. Maybe
thank you.
We can get some input informally from this about children. Could you describe what would happen today in circumstances where an unauthorised encampment is established on private or public land, and what protection would there be for Gypsy Roman Traveller people and their property? Who wants to tackle that one? Jake?
I think Mark, probably in terms of legal process,
okay.
I can probably talk about it on an emotional basis in terms of what happens. Yeah.
Sure, Mark first then.
Well, that might be more important than what I'm going to say, but I'll try and deal with it briefly. I mean, the powers under the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, under Section 61, Section 62A and Section 77, are adequate, sufficient. They've been described as draconian by a number of judges in the High Court, including Lord Justice Sedley, and they give the police and local authorities the powers to step in and require and direct that gypsies and travellers leave a piece of land on which they are trespassing, and that includes both private land and public land. Private land where the occupier has requested that the individual or the family or the group leave, and that request has fallen on deaf ears, and public land where they decide that it's inappropriate that the gypsies or travellers remain. As far as private land is concerned, obviously a private landowner, Farmer Giles, whoever it may be, also has the ability to obtain a possession order, and a swift one at that, under what's known as Part 55 proceedings in the county court, or indeed to resort to self-help, literally getting into some private bailiffs to remove the gypsies or travellers, or use reasonable force to do so. So gypsies and travellers camping on private land are going to have a very short period of time before somebody tells them to move on, and no defence in reality to any legal proceedings which would force them to leave. As far as public land is concerned, well, public authorities do have a duty to take account of humanitarian considerations. There is existing public guidance for local authorities issued by the Secretary of State, currently the Housing and Communities and Local Government, that explains that welfare considerations need to be taken into account. Welfare inquiries therefore need to be undertaken. And the police also have guidance from I think it's from the Association of Chief Police Officers. Janet McCormick will tell us more about that, but it's been updated fairly recently. And so before they take the decision to issue a direction, and indeed subsequently perhaps arrest for failure to comply with the direction, public officials and law enforcement officers will no doubt take into account that guidance. Ultimately, though, if the decision is taken to direct gypsies and travellers to leave, well, they would find it very difficult to not comply, and indeed would ultimately end up before a magistrate and possibly have their vehicles seized. So most Gypsies and Travellers, as far as in my experience anyway, comply with the requirements to leave. And we know that the police, and again, Janet McCormack will tell us more, they're not asking for any increased or strengthened powers. The vast majority of police forces say that the powers are sufficient. What is needed is more sites, temporary, transit, and permanent.
I pursue that question with you, Mark, and then
certainly
if you want to contribute, so they can come in. Some people have called for a greater use of so-called negotiated stopping, where agreements reached between the Gypsy and Travellers and the local authority. Why is this approach preferable to new legislation?
Well, it's humane. It's compassionate. It's proportionate. It is recognition, really, for the fact that the reason that unauthorised encampments will continue to exist is primarily because of a lack of adequate provision of transit and permanent sites. Indeed, this was a very point made by Lord Justice Coulson in the case involving an application for a wide injunction by Bromley, London Borough Council. He made it clear in his judgment that creating no-go zones by virtue of applications for wide injunctions, borough-wide injunctions, breached equality legislation and the European Convention on Human Rights and the enshrined right to roam, and that unauthorised encampments were bound to continue to occur up and down the country unless and until a sufficient number of transit and permanent sites were provided. One doesn't have to necessarily have a transit site which is laid out with individual pitches. I mean, Gypsies and Travellers have travelled around this country stopping on traditional stopping places, green lanes and the like, for centuries. Now, many of those have been stopped up, but there's no reason why local authorities can't think a little bit more imaginatively than a piece of tarmac with perhaps one water tap and nothing more to encourage Gypsies and Travellers to camp on that land. But instead, agree to the possibility of families stopping on a particularly an unused piece of land, a piece of land that's going to be developed in the future, something of that nature, set aside for some sort of development. Thinking outside the box, being imaginative, being compassionate, agreeing with the families that they will get perhaps a portaloo and their rubbish taken away, but they will leave after a certain period of time. This is what negotiated stopping is all about. It's what you do in a grown-up society. The litmus test of a democratic society is, according to Václav Havel and many who've quoted him since, how one treats the Roma population, Gypsies and Travellers in a society. And we should be doing more. We should be doing better. And, it's just not the way to go about treating people. And this piece of legislation, is abhorrent in my professional opinion, and we should be looking at things like negotiated stuff.
Thank you. Is there anything else to add from anyone?
Yeah. I was just wondering if I could just add something, which I think Mark is absolutely right. What you have to see, if you look at it in its historical context, our ancestors stopped all over the place, on commons, on green lanes. You see it in the landscape of Britain everywhere, the Romany roads that there are in every county. It's there, and that's land that has been stolen and taken away from us. And the flip side of it is if you just go towards enforcement and no provision, and this is coming back to your question about children, is you just find that you'll get another generation of abused, bullied and upset people. I think it's an African saying that says, a child that does not feel the love of its village will burn it down to feel some warmth. If you brutalise children in the way that I've seen, through existing police powers, you'll get a disgruntled, upset generation. The thing to do is break that cycle and create provision along the lines that Marc suggested.
Yeah.
Thank you. Could we move to Lord Dubs now for the next question, please?
Thank you, Chair. I'm a Labour member of the Lords. I have visited Roma villages in Romania. Very shocking. I've also seen quite a lot of Roma sites or traveller sites in Northern Ireland and the Republic and in East London. So I'm going to put my questions together for the sake of time. But the bill would criminalise people for living on land, even when there are no other adequate sites for them to go to. If there are insufficient authorised sites for travellers, Roma and Gypsies, doesn't that in effect criminalise homelessness? And secondly, will the bill provide incentives for local, or effective incentives for local authorities to provide adequate sites? And could I just throw in a Northern Ireland question as part of that? I'm a little bit out of date on this, but in Northern Ireland, the travellers, when I spoke to them, said they were very keen for those that didn't want to move all the time. They liked very much the site in Omagh, where there was permanent housing, specially designed for travellers. And some of the travellers said they'd like that. So to what extent do you think travellers are looking for local authorities to provide sites for travellers on the move, as opposed to giving them more permanent accommodation, statically? Who's going to start on that one? Martin, would you like to start on that one?
I can, yeah. I mean, your first question is the incentives for councils. Local authorities UK-wide have already failed to meet the needs of GRT people regarding transit sites and residential sites. And I think this bill could be used by some to scare people in regards to practicing nomadic way of life still. In Wales, it's a human right and protected, so we do have that kind of negotiated stopping-esque type thing where there's guidelines that authorities can use in regards to portaloos and skips and stuff like that. For me, I think criminalising GRT people for practicing a nomadic right is, again, like Mark said, is abhorrent. It's really it's not acceptable, is it? And then you talked about Northern Ireland in regards to residential sites. There are loads of people who would like them. You know, the standard of sites are growing. Essentially, I've been to the one in Winsford in Cheshire. Really nice site, and they've done a good job in leading the way in regards to not putting it by. It's still an industrial state. It's not ideal. It's not like where we'd like trees and fields, where we'd all like our houses to be. You know, but it's. Residential sites that are sustainable, that are healthy, you know, people would accept them. You know, if they were a part of that GTA registered who wanted to stay in that authority and that council, it would be welcome. But I think in any case, you know, more places for people to stay would be welcome in any regard. You know, and this bill, you know, aiming to strip away human rights for us is. You know, is not acceptable, and this is what it'll do. So I'll pass on to Jake. I think he's nodding his head quite.
Well, no, I don't. I know Philomena wants to come in as well, but I just wanted to quickly say that, Lord Dubs, thank you for everything you've done for our community over the years. It's been much appreciated. On the sites, most people, when they look at gypsy sites from the outside, they think they're dens of iniquity and thieves. But actually, I was on one the other day, and I just wanted to tell you this story really quickly. The site of the Joyces in Oxford, where their daughter is about to go for bone marrow treatment, and she won't mind me saying that she's 26 years old. Last week, 120 members of her family that all live on the same site came together and gave her the greatest outpouring of love that I've ever seen a family give to anybody. And that's why people need sites, because if you can live together as an extended family network, then all of that support is there. You know, so it's insane that this is coming from the Conservative Party, which supposedly supports family values. That's real family values, people looking after each other. And of course, it criminalises homelessness, this bill, and it's wrong. And I see that sorry, I'm not going to take over the chair, but Philomena has her hand up.
Yeah, I'd like to just say we need both. We need both. You know, that's our. I hope my internet's still not playing up. We need both. Yeah. But I'm living here in Hackney, and I'm living in a built-up bungalows. It's 8 pitches, but we have bungalows on them. And the new site that we're fighting for, we're hoping to do the same thing again for families that wants to stay, on, but still have the right to travel when they want to travel. But it all comes down to